Welcome to this explainer. So if you picture the Napoleonic Wars, you're probably imagining, these brilliant sunlit victories, pristine uniforms, flawless maneuvers. Well, we're about to get a massive reality check. We're diving right into the Battle of Eylau in 1807. This is exactly what happens when the seemingly unstoppable juggernaut of the French Grande Armée slams into a totally different, completely unyielding kind of wall. We're going to break down the strategies, the brutal environmental conditions, and the literally staggering human cost of a clash that, quite frankly, changed the entire complexion of these wars forever.
Napoleon went into this expecting exactly what he usually got, right? A brilliant, decisive victory, a rapid, crushing blow. He was the guy who dictated the terms of battle. But instead of a swift triumph, he ran headfirst into appalling losses in absolutely freezing, terrible conditions. It really begs a fascinating question. What happens when a conqueror who expects to just brilliantly outmaneuver his enemy meets a blinding, freezing winter storm? The massive gap between that expectation of glory and the muddy, frozen reality on the ground, that's exactly where the tragedy of Eylau unfolds. It wasn't just a battle. It was a desperate, horrific fight for survival against both the enemy and the elements.
So let's set the scene. It's 1807, and we are deep, and I mean deep, into a bitter, unforgiving winter in the territories of Poland and East Prussia. Napoleon is pushing his forces incredibly hard to corner General Bennigsen and his retreating Russian army. Now remember, this isn't your standard clash of empires. By marching his troops here, Napoleon is stretching his operational reach way, way beyond those familiar, relatively temperate battlefields in Western Europe. He is pushing into harsh eastern terrain, dragging his supply lines out to the absolute breaking point in sub-zero temperatures. It's February, it's freezing, and he's walking a massive logistical tightrope.
But, to understand why he's pushing so aggressively into the cold, you have to remember his mindset at the time. Before this deep freeze, Napoleon was riding an unbelievable wave of momentum. He had just pulled off these brilliant, almost effortless victories over major European powers. His soldiers, they literally felt invincible. Morale was absolutely through the roof, and Napoleon himself was basically being looked at across Europe as a strategic god among men. When you've just completely shattered rival military machines with that kind of blinding speed, well, it makes total sense that you'd expect to just roll right over the Russians too, completely ignoring what the thermometer says.
Think of his strategy up to this point like a checklist, and he's been remarkably efficient at checking boxes. Austria, crushed at Austerlitz, effectively knocked off the board. Prussia, completely dismantled at Jena and Auerstedt, done. So that leaves the Russian forces in Poland as the absolute last major continental threat standing in his way. Defeating Bennigsen wasn't just another win on the ledger, it was the final hurdle. Knocking the Russians out would practically secure total French hegemony over Europe. He's thinking, just cross off this last empire, force Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table, and end the war entirely on French terms.
To knock out that final threat, his ambitious tactic is the winter encirclement plan. He doesn't just want to push the Russians back toward Moscow. He wants to trap them and destroy them entirely, right there in East Prussia. It's classic Napoleonic warfare, really. Move way faster than they expect, wrap around the flanks, cut off the retreat, and force a massive surrender. But here's the catch. A maneuver like that takes flawless precision, rapid speed, and crystal clear communication. Pulling that off on a sunny afternoon in Italy is one thing. Trying to do it when your couriers are literally getting lost in blizzards, horses are freezing to death, and artillery wheels are frozen fast in the mud, that turns an elegant plan into an incredibly dangerous gamble.
And almost immediately, those high hopes for a quick, decisive victory just completely unravel. He orders this bold encirclement, but the freezing winter conditions literally stall the plan in its tracks. The real turning point? A massive, blinding, whiteout blizzard suddenly rolls right over the battlefield. We are talking zero visibility. Entire French corps literally lost their way in the snow. General Augereau's 7th Corps wandered blindly right into the teeth of massive Russian artillery fire and was practically wiped out in minutes. With the encirclement totally ruined and the armies locked in place, the battle degenerated into a brutal, face-to-face slog. It wasn't an elegant maneuver anymore. It was a desperate hand-to-hand fight, resulting in just staggering, appalling casualties on both sides.
The historian James Arnold actually calls this whole horrific campaign a crisis in the snows. And honestly, crisis hits the nail right on the head. This wasn't just a tough day at the office for the French military. It was a complete systemic shock. The snow wasn't just some scenic backdrop. It acted like an active combatant. It actively stripped Napoleon of the very things that made him great: his visibility, his speed, his maneuverability. You take away the Grand Armée's ability to outmarch and outflank its enemies, and you basically neutralize its superpowers. Nature itself fundamentally broke the rhythm of the French war machine.
So what we're looking at here is a massive, fundamental shift in the very type of war being fought. All those energetic, brilliant maneuvers and fast-paced triumphs we just talked about, gone. Eylau forced the French into this notorious, grueling winter stalemate. We're talking about a sharp pivot from a war of strategic elegance to a war of pure, miserable attrition. Because think about it, you just cannot outmaneuver an enemy when your troops are wading through knee-deep, freezing slush and your cannons are sinking into snowbanks. The French had to just stand there and trade blows with the Russians in the absolute worst conditions imaginable. It was a horrific, deeply unsettling departure from the sweeping victories they were used to.
The grim reality is that Eylau is universally remembered as one of the most brutal and notorious clashes of the entire Napoleonic Wars. This wasn't just some tactical draw. Tens of thousands of men were left dead or dying in the freezing snow, and neither side walked away with a real decisive advantage from the slaughter. Just to give you an idea of the sheer scale of the desperation, this battle featured the largest cavalry charge in human history up to that point. Marshal Murat led over 10,000 horsemen charging over frozen, blood-stained ground just to keep the French center from completely collapsing. It is a sobering, terrifying reminder of how 19th century warfare could just become a meat grinder in the winter.
Now, zooming out for a second to look at the big picture, Eylau sits right smack in the chaotic middle of Napoleon's massive era of expansion. You have the absolute masterclass of Austerlitz in 1805, the crushing win at Jena Auerstedt in 1806, and then boom, this brutal anomaly in 1807. Now, sure, the Battle of Friedland would happen shortly after and sort of redeem the campaign, but Eylau really stands out starkly. It's sandwiched right between his early, seemingly effortless triumphs and his much more desperate fights for survival, leading up to the 1814 battle for France. Stepping back helps you realize that Eylau wasn't just a bad snowy day. It was arguably the very first crack in the grand facade of French invincibility.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Did those freezing conditions at Eylau actually foreshadow the physical limits of Napoleon's seemingly unstoppable expansion? You know, when a military machine that is entirely built on speed and brilliance gets stopped dead in its tracks by winter and geography, you really have to wonder if this brutal reality check was the first warning sign of the boundaries of his empire. Obviously, the snows of Russia would prove absolutely fatal a few years later. It's a fascinating turning point that invites us to look at the rest of his campaigns in a completely new light. Keep questioning the history and keep analyzing.